All right, good morning. So I feel like shit. Oh my god. Um I'm not sure what happened, but during the night my shoulder something happened, so I started waking up like it felt like every 5 minutes. And then our youngest woke up at 5:30 this morning. So I'm a complete mess. But we're gonna see how bad it is by just trying to do something. And then mm, I might have to take a break a bit earlier today. But I actually did some more work yesterday. So we actually have sandboxes, like dev boxes, VMs running now. So now I have a sandbox of type persistent, and the sandbox ID here goes to an actual dev box, a VM. Oh, wait, is it 53? So now it's loading it up, and this is actually coming from a VM. That's pretty cool. And this preview, like this devbox, is actually using Sandpack, so it's like Sandpack in Sandpack. But what I wanted to try that I didn't try yesterday was, let's go into this thing and then pdevbox. And I'm gonna try to add a file and see if it actually pops up, because we have the listener now. So if I were to add a file here, it should automatically pop up there. Let's see what happens. New file, test txt. Hello. Let's go back. Well, that didn't happen. So there was supposed to be a watcher on this folder. And oh, that sucks. Why didn't that work? Did I actually implement that? I want to check that first, because that's kind of a cool thing. Watch, update entries. Yeah, interesting. It should have worked. Yeah, so let's see. Watch that. Oh, I think maybe I know what it is. So let's see, VM file system, watch directory. Oh yeah, I know what it is. We should say this workspace path plus path. Okay, I'm gonna delete the file again, and then we're gonna try. Oops. Delete. Yes. Okay, cool. We need to build that. Let's go. Let's go into Sandpack environments. Yarn build. Oh, is it yarn or is it pm? I can't remember. Whatever. Cool. So now let's refresh. It's kind of funny we see it connected there. CodeSandbox SDK. Okay, so let's try again. Let's go into source directory. Let's see what happens if I. Oh. Oh, what happened here? There we are. Weird. Test.txt. Hello. Hey, look at that. Test.txt. Hello. That's pretty cool, right? Yes, but what we're going to do now is that we're going to implement some actions. So we're going to write back. First, we're going to do a write file. So we're going to write back to the VM, and like it's very, very difficult to find a good API surface for this, because if we're on a VM, you don't actually need to implement a write action. So it's like, so if it's ephemeral, you don't need a write action. You really only need a write action if you have custom persistence. or you're using a browser sandbox for CodeSandbox, which is basically, yeah. So it's almost like I am thinking about like being more explicit about these different environments, because there are like, but at the same time, it's like you don't. Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's almost like, oh, don't I have environment options? Hey, why aren't you showing the environment options? I thought I had them there. Let's check them. Static sandbox, VM sandbox. Yeah, environment options. Why isn't that showing up? That's weird. What is this children thing? Can't be used as a JSX. It's type. Let me see. I think it's just because we're using the wrong. Children. Yeah, no idea what this is. Type and return element is not assignable to type. But why does it say element? Sandbox provider. Why can't? It's so broken that. It's a provider. React provider. And here it's React node. I don't understand this. Type element is not assignable to type React node or promise React node? There's missing. Oh, look at this. Oh, now we have it there. Okay, I'm not sure about this element thing. I think it's related to, maybe it's like types React. Like, what do we actually use here? Types React 18. And which version of React are we? Yeah, 18, but the prototype has what? Yeah, 19. Yeah, that's the reason. Okay. And then React 19. Okay, interesting. Okay. I think that's the reason. It's just crashing typing. Okay, but what I was thinking about, sorry about that, is that these actions might be more suited for environment options. But environment options isn't like ephemeral, persisted DevBox kind of thing. Environment options is that, yeah, it's the actual running thing. Like, I'm having such a hard time differentiating persistence from mode. Like, you have, there's like mode, persistence, and environment. So you could have, instead of having, so this is environment options, that's fine. But then you have like this what should we call it? Like mode options, where you would have like ephemeral. I'm just calling it mode for now. Ephemeral, persisted. But then you would also have, what would we call the last thing, which is like the VM. Oh, but maybe actions could be ephemeral, persisted. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, what is the last thing? It's there is a last thing here, which is not persisted. It's like, I guess VM. I think that's, so there's no like VM environment. Well, I guess there is. Yeah, because that's the thing. It's like bundler and static environment works with persisted mode. But then you have VM, which is like the, which is a mode which only works with the VM environment. But ephemeral also works with bundler and static, and it might also work with VM. So what are these things? Because the point is, in ephemeral, you would only have fork. That's the only action you have in an ephemeral sandbox, because you can only type something, you can try to save or make a change to it, and then it needs to fork, and then it will move you into like a persisted or VM sandbox based on yeah, this is interesting. It's almost like ephemeral isn't even, yeah, it's almost like you can choose ephemeral, or wait a minute. So what if it wasn't ephemeral, it was template? So you choose, so if it's a template, you can give it like files. You can choose to give it like active, you choose an environment, bundler, static, or VM. And you can choose active file. Well, main is bound to bundler. Yeah, but that's fine. Yeah, sorry. So active file is tied to ephemeral in this case. And these others are currently bound to the environment. But we might say that files, and I wonder if we should call it entry instead of main. We should do that. But the point is, if this was called a template instead, and when it's a template, you can still, yeah, it's almost like you choose between hard coding something, or you get it from a reference. So it can still be a template, but you can choose to grab that template either from like your persistence thing, or you can even connect to a VM, and that acts as your template. And then, but you can't write or anything. The only thing you can do here is actually fork. So if you have a template, the only thing that can happen is that you can fork. Given that, but that's not true, because if it's local, you can make changes to it, but you can't do that if it's persisted or it's a VM. This is like designing an API surface for this is just I have no like it's so powerful, but if people don't understand understand it, and the problem is like what normally the way I would handle this is to just separate this into different providers in this case. But the problem is that you can move between them. You can move from ephemeral to a VM to persistence. You can even move from persistence to ephemeral if you wanted to do that. Like, so it needs to be one provider. And when you actually define this provider, depending on your scenario, even it doesn't matter if you use one or all of these different modes, you have to configure all of them in a single provider because you can move from one to the other. So that's kind of like why I did the action series. It's like it doesn't really matter what you choose to load here, because it might be dynamic what you're trying to load in this thing. So it might be a persistent sandbox, might be a VM, it might be a ephemeral thing. Just go in and define all the actions. But then your use case might be very specific. Maybe you only do ephemeral. Then you don't need any actions. Maybe you do ephemeral and persisted in a database. Well, then you need actions and write file and delete file and all of this stuff. But then you might say, no, I'm only going to use VMs. And then you don't need write file and delete file because that just happens on the VM itself. So, but maybe that's the thing. No, that's not the thing. Well, and I would love for that to be explicit in the props here, in the API surface. Like what is actually needed when you want to load a VM? Ephemeral. So it's like, I really want to use the type here to define what actions you need. So if it's ephemeral, it means that you will need a fork action. But if that's, well, but that's the thing, you might not want fork. Because it's almost like if you have ephemeral and persisted, then you have to implement fork. Huh. I am so confused by this. Okay, so one thing we're gonna do here, we're gonna downgrade to React 18, I think, just to avoid having these type errors. But yeah, I can't get my brain around how we should design this API. What should we do? What should we do? How should I approach this? Should I sit here and think about it until something comes out, or Should we just implement features and let it grind in the background? That's probably the best way to approach it, or at least most productive. But I'm not controlled by my rational brain. Oh, and I'm so tired. Ugh. But I do like the idea of like calling this a template. I do like that because it reflects the concept of a template. But then if we call that template, then we have to either allow you to do a sandbox ID, and then environment is not there. So it's like either, it's almost like environment here is like inferred, and then you choose like a sandbox ID. That's kind of like, that's what it really means. It's like you can choose an environment. So if you choose bundler, you choose static. Yeah. Then you can define the files. But if you do like inferred, you just need like a sandbox ID or like a reference or whatever. So what it means is that we don't know the environment. It's going to be inferred by something that you get by a reference. That's interesting. But then you could also say, this is not a template, this is bundler. Okay, what if we do this instead? So you have a type bundler. So you don't have to define the environment. That's done by the type. Okay, so there's a type bundler, which means there's a type static, and you can say like active file, and you can also say like what files are in there. Sorry, files. And I talked to Eves about like these different templates that they don't really make that much sense. It would be interesting to explore how we can drop having the actual templates. Like we have a Vite template in Sandpack, which should like work with most things. And if it doesn't, we can rather fix that. So we have a generic bundler instead of having this like very specific bundler. But I'm not sure if that, yeah, how that would actually work. But that means like we might still have like a template here. That's fine. Okay, let's include that. So template, it's called parcel currently, like having just that stuff. Oh, by the way, the problem with the reason that we didn't get the bundler working was because on CodeSandbox.io, we have this special preview that where the server actually finds an index.html file in the files of the sandbox, and then actually serves that to the preview. So when we had our sandbox with the index.html file in the source directory, what happens in the API on the server is that it finds that HTML file and then provides that on the URL of the preview. But that doesn't happen in Sandpack. So what I have to do something similar here. So if like the template is parcel, I have to go and find the index.html file and put it on the root. And then Sandpack understands how it's gonna work. So that's like, but that's part of like historic magic, and we want to get away from that. Anyways, so what if we do this instead? And then we can say type like inferred or something like that. And then you just need, or maybe we call it sandbox. And then you have a sandbox ID like that. Let's keep those things. So what if we did this instead? What does this mean? What does this mean? So now the type is kind of referring to the environment, except that, yeah, because the only way to load the VM, and like we're not leaking, that's the thing. We should not leak the environment into the Surface API, because the only reason for having VM as an environment is when you use a sandbox. Though the interesting thing is this files thing. Like, what if you do want to So we talked about having ephemeral VMs. And in that case, if you do type sandbox, well, I guess you could do, it's interesting because you definitely need, yeah, what do you actually need? So how would it look like if we actually, because this is like just loading up something existing. Hello, Evan. IDE. What do you mean, IDE? So the comments, by the way, are a bit behind. So I often lose context when I read the comments. So you'll have to excuse that. Oh. Yeah, sorry, Evan. Yeah, it's VS Code. But I've like it's zoomed in a lot, so it looks a bit weird maybe. Oh, let's see. Okay. I just like I'm really sorry about like this being long-winded, but I have to talk through this. This is the only way I can get through complexity. It's just poking at things. and throwing terminology and just rerunning everything in my brain all the time. I think some people are like incredible at solving complexity, like at the savant level. I'm no savant. I'm the poker. I just poke at stuff until I find something. I remember I was at a conference once, and there was this group assignment thing where we it was like a Scrum kind of conference, and we were gonna build this Sudoku board, and we were gonna produce like X amount of Sudoku boards, and how would we like approach that? And I remember like using my poking ability, I just started writing like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It was like how many? Like 9 times 9 squares. I just wrote like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then okay, let's then write the next one, which would then start on 2, for example, and it starts on 3, and then it starts on 3, and then but how do we do it on the next like 3 by 3 squares? And then I started like just flipping things around and just poking at it. And then suddenly there was, by changing the first number, you would get like a completely new Sudoku board. And then someone else said, oh, but if we move this over here, then you had like 10 times as many Sudoku boards or something. But anyways, it's not like I didn't see that. It was the poking that did it. And I think that's the savant level of like dealing with complexity, is not poking. They just know. But I guess, yeah, poking is a valid strategy. Anyways, I'm diverging. So what if we call it bundler, static, and sandbox? And this works for most things. And we're not leaking the environment to the surface, which I really like. This is about what you want. It's not about like how it's gonna run. And then but then we have the ephemeral VM environment. So if you were to be allowed to do files like this, the thing is that now you have to choose, is this going to be like a persisted thing? Is this going to be a browser sandbox? Like, is it going to be one of these, only persisted? But I guess that doesn't make sense, because then you would do this, or you... Yeah, I think the thing I'm having a hard time with is that, like, what's the, like, you could never create anything in Sandpack before. You could only have this ephemeral thing. Like you hard code like a Sandpack or a sandbox, and that's what runs, and you're not creating anything. But now we actually are able to load something that's already been created. But then there's like some inconsistency there, because on one end you're able to define something new that's not persisted, and you could load something that's already persisted. And then, but where does the creation happen, right? And the thing about VMs that's interesting about VMs is that they act as both persistent. That's the thing. A VM is persistence and an environment, as opposed to, this is where it's breaking. When I call it persistence, it means that the sandbox is actually persisted. But then we have a VM, which yes, is persistence, but it's also an actual environment of running your code. Unlike a browser sandbox persistence, which is just, okay, I'm just going to store the files in the database kind of thing. It's nothing about environment. So we have to have a clear separation of what is persistence and what is the environment. So what if we kind of... Okay, so let's drop persistence for now. So we're not persisting anything. We're just able to... Okay, so that means I would be, if we're going to have ephemeral VMs, it would mean we would have to be able to do something like this. Right? And technically how we would solve that is, I'm having a session with one of the backend engineers, but we think that we should be yeah, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do it, but we might need so you have like a template or something, like a reference to an existing DevBox or existing VM, and then we're going to hash the files and we're going to tag it. So you can so if you were to go in here and you were to change the files, so maybe you're deploying like a documentation or something, and then you change the files, it will go and create kind of like a new DevBox automatically based on the hashing of the files. So kind of combination of the template and the hashing of the files. The problem though is that you're probably like just doing this live, right? So you're like making some change to the code, you save it, and then you look at it, and then like you're working on a PR or something. And then it's just going to create this new DevBox every time you make a change. And that's silly. So I'm not sure how we're going to do that. It's much better that you... Like the ideal thing that should happen technically is that you choose a template. So you choose an existing VM. Sorry, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, this is where .NET Framework is selling my own, but yeah, you know, like the thing about JavaScript is like it's such a not double-edged sword, but it's so like it's so incredibly accessible from one perspective, but it's so open-ended from a different perspective. So any like the good thing about any other language is the tooling. Like everything's built around the language. Like if you see things like even like Rust coming out now, or Go, or like any other language, they have all the tooling built with the language, like all the linting, all the formatting, all the building, everything's like first class, and especially like third-party dependencies. But JavaScript is like, it just started as a scripting language, and then it's been driven by open source, right? And people are just jumping on and saying, oh, let's create an NPM registry. Oh no, let's rather create Yarn because NPM is slow. And this is fundamentally a good thing, but it's exhausting for the consumers. So you have a lot more like innovation, arguably, and just the fact that it's driven by the community, very open-ended, is very exciting, but it's insanely exhausting. Um, what was I thinking about? Yes, so if you were gonna have yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like I remember, like I've dived into some other languages, like on the surface, like reading like Python and Rust, the Rust book. I really like Rust. For some reason, it just kind of clicks with me. But just it doesn't matter. Any other language I dive into, it's like, oh, this is how you install dependencies. This is how you build. This is how you format. This is how you ship it. Like it's like all first class. It's such a relief compared to JavaScript. I don't know how many streams I've been cursing and just going batshit crazy over CommonJS versus ESM modules and how it's such a hassle for library authors to deal with this and running Node, and then yeah, it's horrible, exhausting. It's just exhausting. Okay, cool. So if we were gonna have ephemeral VMs, you need to have some reference to the actual VM you're gonna run it on. But the problem is, if you're allowed, so let's imagine you create an open source library and you want to show some examples and you need a VM environment to run those examples. Now the thing is, you wanna in the actual like library documentation, you want to write the files, like you want to write the example, but you just want a VM to run those files, right? The thing is that there's like this one VM that's going to run these files. So if you want to make a change to it, you really have to go to a new VM, or you break the experience of anyone's that's actually looking at your documentation at this point when you're working on this new PR where you're changing the code. It's the same VM, so that won't work. But then the question becomes like, okay, so you're sitting there and you're manipulating these files, but every time you change those files, it's going to create a new hash, and it's gonna like create a new VM for you, which is also horrible. So you would have to like explicitly say, yeah, you would have to, maybe this is the thing. Yeah, because we have something called a tag, or tags. I'm not quite sure how they work. Maybe we can actually figure that out. CodeSandbox SDK. So, is there any documentation here? Docs. Tags. No, I think this is something else. Yeah, no, I have to discuss this more, how these tags work. I think we're going to leave this alone. Like the ephemeral VM. I just want to produce some connections in my brain for them. But I think this is kind of how it would, some version of this is that some place you have to create like the initial DevBox for this. Or maybe you have to do that. So there has to be like some sandbox ID here. That's kind of like the starting point. And then you can choose a tag, which is going to create a version of that sandbox or that VM. So, and then you can have files there, and you can define these files. And what it's going to do is, if the version, if the tag doesn't exist, it's going to go in and it's going to write these files. So you could start out, well, again, this is tricky because what if you want to, so for example, let's take a library. So Sandpack router, for example, they want to use VMs for their documentation. And what if they have a VM that has like the base VM for their documentation? The question then becomes like, that base VM, what should it like contain? Because if it doesn't contain, like I'm thinking about the version of the Sandpack router. If they change the version of the Sandpack router, they probably want to do that in the example. Or do they? Would they even do that? Like, would they actually write a package JSON here? Like files. Oh, look at that. Package JSON. And then they would like have like dependencies, and then they will write Sandpack router, whatever. Is that how they would do it? But that means that, okay, but let's imagine we did that. And then whenever you, okay, so you have a new tag, we go and check if that tag exists. And if it doesn't exist, we'll go create it for you. And we would also need to restart. That's the thing. We would also need to restart a VM. Or not restart a VM, but we will have to reinstall the dependencies. Yeah, like this is incredibly tricky to do. Yeah. So yeah, so this is the thing. It's like the VM environment is like, it's really just like a Docker container. I guess you can think of it as the closest thing. So you basically wanna be able to, every time you change the version of your documentation, you want to create a new Docker container for the examples, given that you actually make changes to the examples. So that's what the tag does. It just says, okay, we have a new tag for this example, and that controls if we need to actually create a new VM or not. But this is, I don't see how this is going to work in practice, because there's so much complexity to this. So let's imagine from scratch. It's like you're Sandpack router maintainer. You want to create this example. You have a sandbox ID, which is like an empty, it's just an empty universal container. So you could even call it template. Let's call it, to make it perfectly clear. So you have template node. So you have this node container. And then you're going to say, this is going to be my version 1. And I'm going to put package JSON here. Dependencies is like Sandpack router or whatever it is. And I'm going to have like source, index, JSX, whatever. And this is going to be my version. And the first time you run this, we're going to check if there is a version 1. Yeah, even there's a complexity, because you don't own this template. Anyways, let's just make it a unique name, Sandpack router version 1. or like example 111 or something unique. So you do this, and the first time you actually save this file, you're working on a PR, you're running your documentation in dev mode, and you save the thing. What's going to happen is that you're actually going to see this preview running, but what happens in the background is that we didn't find a tag on this one. So what happens is that we fork this template, and then we tag that VM with this thing, and then we write these files to that VM. That's what we do because we didn't find it. We didn't find the tag. So it's going to run that, and then that works, right? And then you can, the question though then becomes like, okay, what if you make changes to this thing? Like, what are we actually going to do? What if you suddenly choose, no, it's not going to be called index.jsx, it's going to be called index.js. Well, now you have an index.jsx file in that VM. So we kind of have to clean the whole thing every time. Which is also very interesting. So that's a big ass problem. But anyways, so let's imagine you're happy with this and you're shipping that to production. And now anyone that's looking at those examples, we find the tag, we just show the VM at its current state. And then you say, oh no, we have some changes to the router. And we want to go in and we want to change the documentation. So the first thing you do is you go in and you change the version. So now you save that, like you're in development mode, you change the code of your documentation to this, it runs the preview, we've created a fork again of this template, we write the files to the thing, and then you kind of see the example again. And then you start manipulating these files, and then at the end of the day, you have this new VM. Oh, yeah, no. So this is, yeah, you're being dropped into a lot of context here. So the thing is, CodeSandbox.io is, CodeSandbox is a service where you can go in and write code in the browser. And originally, CodeSandbox was a service where you had browser sandboxes. So everything ran in the browser, and you could explore the full ecosystem of JavaScript with all these different libraries and everything just happens right there in the browser. So for example, here we have like React, and you can choose to run it as a sandbox in the browser, or you can choose to run it on a VM. So the point is that we only had browser sandboxes in the beginning. But then CodeSandbox pivoted against using VMs instead, because JavaScript has evolved and there's a lot more server-side running code. And there's a lot of other stuff you can also... and there's also a lot of other languages we certainly could run. And we had this like really great experience in the browser that people really liked. And we wanted to be able to create experience we had for in-browser bundling with VMs. So we had like these insane constraints for making these VMs fast enough to create as close as possible experience to, it felt like you were just running it in the browser. But nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted that product. So what's happening now is that like CodeSandbox was acquired by Together AI. So we're using all this technology for AIs really, but there's still a lot of people that's using CodeSandbox. And instead of us like maintaining CodeSandbox as a product, which is going to take our focus away from all the tooling we're creating for AI, we want to pivot this open source Sandpack library to become like a mini CodeSandbox, which means that it should just handle any of the use cases that people are using it for now, which means that some people are using CodeSandbox for documentation. Some people are using it for design systems, for education. Like there's a lot of different use cases for CodeSandbox. And we rather want to put that in a package that's open source and driven by the community. Yeah. And then it's like what we're battling now is like finding this API surface that kind of generically encapsulates all those use cases. Yeah, no worries, Mark. Like this is the thing, like doing these streams, it's like I'm sitting here like 3 hours working on something very detailed. It's super hard for people to pick up on the context. And I'm not very good at like writing descriptions on the videos or anything. But yeah, so like I worked for CodeSandbox for like almost 5 years, and but we're part of Together now. So we're like figuring out like what should really happen to CodeSandbox so that we can, yeah, as I mentioned, like use the technology that makes most sense for Together to evolve as a product, but also not kind of just remove all the features that people love about CodeSandbox that doesn't fit with Together. So that's what Sandpack is going to represent. It's kind of we talked about it many times because CodeSandbox has always been very transparent, and as at least with the first like browser editor, it was completely open source. So yeah, Sandpack just puts us back into that open source world. But it will be much more powerful because it also has VMs. Yeah, I wouldn't say like integration problem. It's more like, so we have so the integration with Together. It's a great question. So the integration with Together is what we call the CodeSandbox SDK. And that's a thing that's rolling now. It's going to have its official release very soon. And that's like a traditional SDK, which is all about talking to the VMs. So that's something very similar to like the OpenAI SDK or the Together SDK kind of thing. And even though that also has its like challenges in like deciding the API surface and stuff, but that's like a different project. I'm actually working on that as well, and I haven't streamed anything on it. Maybe I'll do that because I'm working on that later today. But that's the integration with Together. So we kind of figured that out. So this is more like, more the integration with the existing community of CodeSandbox. How can we empower them to use this open source Sandpack with all the features they love from CodeSandbox? But instead of going to CodeSandbox.io, we're giving them kind of like this NPM package that allows them to just run sandboxes in whatever use case they're used to. If they just want to run it locally to play around with some code, or if they want to run it in the company to explore, to have design system examples and stuff like that, or you want to run it for educational purposes, like it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's a very back and forth rundown. Yeah, CodeSandbox is a really cool product. It's really sad that we weren't able to monetize it. Like we tried first to monetize the browser sandboxes, but nobody wanted to pay for it, understandably. And then we went all in on cloud development, and we had a really, really cool product, but it was just so difficult to kind of break through the status quo because developers don't want to write code in the cloud. At least that's our experience. But we had so many cool features, like and then everybody was used to VS Code, and we kind of wanted to create a new experience. So but everybody was like, no, but I use this in VS Code, blah blah blah. So we had to do a lot of pivots, and we just couldn't find a market fit. But the really, really cool thing we did there was you could just take a repo and you could paste it on CodeSandbox.io. We would create a VM for you that automatically set up that repository. And with the Firecracker technology we use, we are able to hibernate that VM, but we take a snapshot of the memory and the file system. So instead of like working locally on each developer working locally on the project and creating branches is something you do in the local environment, we would rather allow you to create a branch on CodeSandbox, but that branch would actually be its own VM. So we had one VM representing your main branch of the project that was always up to date. Every time something happened to that branch on GitHub, we would wake up the VM, pull in the changes, hibernate, snapshot it. And then when you create a branch, it takes like less than 2 seconds. You have a brand new VM with the latest version of the main branch running, all the dev servers, everything running, and you can just start coding immediately. And then you could just share the URL and people could drop into each other's sessions and stuff like that. It was super, super powerful, but like nobody wanted it for some reason. We loved it. We actually built the CodeSandbox experience using that flow. So we kind of dog-fooded it like crazy. But yeah. Yeah, the experience is poorer, right? You have to have a really, like, it's a latency thing, right? It's kind of like, if you can, I often compared it to video games. It's like, if you're used to playing a video game in like 60 FPS and then you're dropping to like 20 FPS, you actually notice the latency. Then it sucks. Like, it's not the same experience, and that is cloud development. So what we struggled with was we had features that you couldn't replicate locally, like the flow I just talked about. That was like super powerful. But we were trying to explain those flows that was like novel, like, but people didn't understand them. You had to experience those flows to actually understand them. So we struggled a lot with that. And then we struggled with feedback of users saying, no, we want all these VS Code features. So then suddenly you have VS Code in the browser with poor performance, right? Which is like a really bad start. So maybe if we actually went all in, created our own editor, maybe that would have made a difference. Like, we would have less of a target audience, but we would actually find an audience. But this is product development. It's difficult. But at the end of the day, it turned out that our infrastructure works much better for AI than humans. So that's kind of where we're at now. But yeah, I totally understand why developers don't want to work in the cloud. Yeah, exactly like Stadia cloud gaming. Exactly. It was just gaming with a poorer performance or poorer experience. Yeah, I agree. And I think, like, in retrospect, like the founders of CodeSandbox, they had so much success in the beginning of CodeSandbox by just listening to the users. Like, there was this insanely tight iteration loop using Twitter with the community. And that brought CodeSandbox to it was millions and millions of sandboxes, hundreds of thousands of users. Nobody paid for it, or a few people paid for it. But that's how it got to be a very useful tool, at least. And then I think that kind of followed into trying to monetize it and pivoting to cloud development. it was like still trying to have that tight iteration loop, but we were creating something novel, right? As you say, people don't know what they actually want. They just know what they have. And then that didn't work that well. But like it's way more complex than that. But yeah, it's really difficult to find market fit with novel ideas. And finding a good way to get there. But yeah. Okay, so kind of to put like a final thing on this VM, ephemeral VM, we can do it, but it means that every time the problem is if you have a tag and you make changes to the files on that tag, that's a problem, because we won't be able to efficiently like understand when you're removing files. It means we kind of have to clean the dev box every time. And also if you make changes to dependencies, we'll have to probably restart some dev server. But I guess like you would actually have tasks here, which is like setup tasks and stuff. But yeah, it would be much more complicated. Or you could also say it doesn't matter. Like if you happen to like change some files, it doesn't matter if the other files are there. Well, it doesn't feel right, but like pragmatically, it doesn't matter. Like I guess there's scenarios where it could be a problem. Or at least confusing. It could be confusing. Yeah, but I wonder how we would actually do that. Okay, but this is not something we're going to support now. But it's nice to have kind of talked through it. So let's get back to, okay, we have a bundler, we have static, or, yeah, so I guess this is the problem. It's like, what if we introduce Sandbox now? We can do that. And then we have a Sandbox ID. So this is just using a reference. Yeah, but I think this makes sense. So we can say Sandbox, and then, but now we're saying that this is like more of a type of, I don't like Sandbox. I like this to be like external or something. Like it's just a reference to a sandbox. And then we're gonna infer the environment from that external reference. So we don't say persisted because that doesn't make sense for a VM. It's just external. No, I really like. I really appreciate when it gets interactive, the stream. So I am happy to diverge, and often like people can get like if you're in the zone, right, and you know all the next steps, then it's like it can be distracting if you're interrupted. But I'm rarely in that mode. That's like why I do the streams. It's because I'm not in the zone. I kind of, it's very open-ended to me, and having these distractions just puts the stuff I'm actually working on, it's kind of still going in the background, and then I can just like consciously talk about something else. And it's for me, it's a good process. So don't worry about that. Let's see. So if external is the correct name, it can be argued, but it does represent that. But then again, this is like pointing to specific environments. It's almost like, okay, so what if we just say local and then static is actually just a template? Because this is also how we're going to infer it from the database. It's if the template of the sandbox is static, we're just going to run a static environment. So we don't really have this, and this fits with like actually having active files and stuff like that. So you're either doing a local thing or ephemeral. Yeah, because we shouldn't call it a template. But then VM doesn't fit in with that. Well, yeah, because then you would kind of like have to have VM as a template. And it's not local, that's for sure. But maybe, okay, let's call it ephemeral again. So it's ephemeral, and we're actually going to use the template to decide, like, because for the users, it shouldn't really, how should I put it? It shouldn't really matter. Like if the environment leaks into the Surface API, it's for me it's an indication that we're doing something wrong, because the whole point of this is to make it so you don't think about the environment. We're just gonna efficiently run it for you, but that might be like too high of a bar, because there are certainly developers that's going to be using this, so you shouldn't take that away from them either. Yeah, no, VM has to be, because it needs tasks, it needs tag, like it needs this stuff. What if we call it browser? Oh, that's interesting. That's literally what we've always called them, browser sandboxes. Okay, so what if we call it that? It's a browser sandbox, and then we could we could later introduce a VM sandbox, where you have like the same kind of like, the template is just referencing like actual VM templates instead of browser templates. You have the tag and you have tasks for the VM. So tasks are really just what's it going to do on its setup, like npm install and stuff like that. Okay, this is interesting. And then this is more like external means just go and fetch it externally, and then we are going to infer how to run that sandbox. Yeah, and then we could, yeah, exactly. But external, but does that mean, so the thing that's kind of breaking now is that we did have this typing where we could actually say bundler sandbox, static sandbox, but now it's browser sandbox, and that's fine. We can say that it's a browser sandbox, and we can also say that it's a VM sandbox, but then that type doesn't fit with this thing. But I guess it doesn't do that anyways, because it's going to return a session. Okay. Yeah, but that's fine. They don't have to be the same, these types and the type we return from external. So what I'm wondering is, so external isn't the right, because external means it's almost like maybe persisted would make sense here again. No. Yeah, but it is, or by reference, like it's a reference. Okay, I'm gonna ask ChatGPT what it thinks about this. Let's see. So I am working on this interface for users to create code sandboxes. As you can see, we have 3 types of sandboxes. We have 3 types of sandboxes. I am not certain about the reference one. The name does not jive with me. It really represents that we use a sandbox ID to fetch a sandbox that will return information about how to run it. What do you think would be a good name for that type? By the way, I saw GitHub released a MCP server, which is interesting. So you can like hook it up, GitHub up to your remote import. I don't like that. Remote. I don't like that either, because it could be like, it could even be local storage. Personal, I love that. Personally. Yeah, remote. Yeah, import is interesting. I never thought about it like an import. It's also interesting how we kind of use an ID here. Like we're forcing it to use like you could even say like import and then like fetch, and you could actually have, you could just do this. That's interesting. Yeah, maybe import isn't the right term yet. But it's interesting to just use a function. Because what you would do then is like you would just go in and like fetch sandboxes, whatever. And then sandbox ID would come from the URL or whatever you're using. And that means we don't have get sandbox here. That would mean this code would actually be... Okay, let's just keep exploring this one. So you wouldn't have actions. You would rather have like get sandbox or whatever. Get sandbox. That's interesting. But what does that mean for the others? So you would still have actions, but that would be like fork. Or would that make more sense on the environment now? No, because it doesn't matter if it's bundler or static. Like this is about persistence. So it doesn't matter for the environment options. It's more like... Yeah. So you have fork, and let's just take two of them. So you have fork and you have write file. So if you were to load up a browser sandbox like this, and you have a fork action, and then someone would like change the... Yeah, and I think still you would kind of want to have this like template thing, but maybe that's too implicit. It's almost like... Yeah. Because the thing is, if you do browser, you're able to actually... yeah, but this is also bad. Like doing a function here, then you can't like serialize it, which might be a problem. But it's also like if you fork a browser, that's gonna require you to actually create a sandbox. Yeah, but that doesn't... But that's kind of the same as import. It's like you're a browser sandbox, you do something that requires you to like fork it off. But you might not want that experience because it's in the browser. So you can allow every user to just mess around with their version. So what should trigger that behavior? What should trigger that behavior? It's almost like maybe we shouldn't... No. Is it the fact that you have fork that is going to do it? So if you don't have a fork action, it's just not going to do it. But that's so implicit. Because what would then happen with a VM? Like it wouldn't... If it was a VM, you wouldn't be able to do anything. You can't do anything with it as a consumer. You have to actually save it. Because it's not local. It's not your session. This is a shared session. Unlike this one, which is an isolated session. But maybe that's the thing But okay, so maybe this is where it should be two different providers. So you have like a Sandpack. I don't know what I want to call it. But you have like the browser type is its own provider, because this is like a local experience. It has nothing to do with persistence or anything. And then if you have that provider, you can do on change or something, and you can choose. So if you have an on change, you can go and you can like block. Yeah, it should be a, I don't know, whatever, fork. I don't know, whatever. So if you have fork, it's going to be a blocking thing. So whenever the user tries to save something, add a file, delete a file, doesn't matter, and you have a fork property, it's going to run that fork. And in here, you would decide what you want to do with it. Do you want to create a persistent browser sandbox? Do you want to move to a VM? Like, it doesn't matter. You can choose to do that here. But then there's no like sandbox. It's just like active file, template, files. That's the properties. And there's no actions or anything. Because if you do that, you want to move to a different component, right? You want to move to a different page that actually has a reference to the thing that the user actually created. So that means that we're changing the URL, but the problem is we want you to stay in the same Sandpack provider. This is the whole thing. It's like CodeSandbox is completely seamless. So when you make a change to something that's not yours, we, under the hood, we change out the references. So it feels like you're just changing it. So we have to have the same provider. But okay. So, but what if we do this? So we say type browser. And when it's type browser, you can say template. Template, React, whatever, parcel. And then you have files and all this stuff. That's kind of nice. Whatever. Or if you choose type VM, you would have the same stuff, but you would have like these additional properties. So that's a nice union for the Sandpack provider. But then what would happen if you did import? Because here you could also do on fork, right? On fork. And then you would return whatever import returns. That would be the same thing. And the same would happen here. If you choose VM, you would also have on fork. Well, you would have to have on fork. Yeah, that's interesting. So for type browser, you don't have to have on fork. If you don't have on fork on a VM, it becomes read only. Well, it doesn't become read only for the browser because you're in the browser and you're allowed to play around with things. Does that make sense? Okay, let's say that makes sense. And then we could do type import, where we would say get sandbox. But this is exactly where it gets tricky. because now this is where it gets tricky. Because now we are back with these actions. So it really only makes sense to have actions when you have type import. Because when you do, what does import mean? It means that yeah, the thing is, like, you might even import something. Like fork on change. Like, that's the thing. And you can still have fork on change here. But then again, like, it's only if you do, it's only if it's an actual, like, persisted thing. What's also interesting though is that yeah, if it's a VM, you have to grab it from CodeSandbox. At least currently, we talked about making that interface generic as well, but I'm not sure if that makes sense. Because what it really only needs is a preview and a file system. But it represents more like yeah, but better implementation there would be I really want to separate VMs. Like, when you import something, I want to separate VMs from just persisted browser sandboxes. I really want to do that. And we do that on CodeSandbox as well. Like, there's never like any, you don't go and just load a sandbox ID and then we choose the right environment. You literally go to 2 different URLs. And then if you happen to use an ID for the wrong type of sandbox, we redirect you. But here we have the exact same editor. There's something about, like, hiding the environment. But this is nice. Fork on change. But we only need write file, delete file, and stuff like that if the sandbox we're getting here is an actual browser sandbox. Because if it's a VM sandbox, we don't need write file or delete file. That's the thing that I can't get past right now. It's just so weird. I did think about, like, what's interesting is that our SDK or our VMs, they also have a REST API now. So you could like what makes this thing so unique is that we're connecting to the VM with a WebSocket connection. But we could rather, maybe we should do that. Maybe that's the problem here. We're connecting to the VM with a WebSocket connection. And that just doesn't fit in here. Because if we use, and the thing is like, that actually has some overhead. That actually has some overhead. Because now, like you actually have active sessions on the VM as opposed to someone just jumping in and yeah, and you would have like, if you have multiple examples, you would have like multiple WebSocket connections to different VMs, and it would be a good way to actually test the REST endpoints. I'm gonna ask. It would differently than other persisted sandboxes. So less overhead on picture. Yeah, that would certainly help. Do you need to delete files though? Permissions are a wonderful thing. Yeah, like it depends on the use case, I guess. Because a use case is that, okay, so one thing you can use this for is like you can have your personal CodeSandbox. So you basically just run the thing, and then you open up, like you just have these prototypes you're playing around with. And then, yeah, you kind of need that full flexibility of like moving files and deleting files and creating files to work on those prototypes. But if we used our REST endpoints for the VMs, then these actions would make sense. Then write file, all of these would make perfect sense. Because then it doesn't matter where there wouldn't even be, like we wouldn't leak the environment, or the environment wouldn't leak, or the environment wouldn't affect the Surface API. Because now these would make perfect sense, because these needs to call a server to actually write the file to the VM using the REST endpoint. And we wouldn't need to like start. We wouldn't need to have this dynamic get sandbox either. Get sandbox would just be get sandbox. And then, well, we would, yeah, no. A difference would be it wouldn't have like the files. Well, yeah, no, it's still weird. Because here you have like read directory. That doesn't make... Yeah, no, it's still weird. Because redirect... Yeah. So it's like, okay. So the like... The right way to do it is kind of like... like if it's a VM, you have certain actions. What are the actions if it's a VM? There aren't any actions. That's the thing. There aren't any actions when it's a VM because they're just inherent. But if you need to persist the changes, yeah, and that's why I don't like this generic import. It would be better if it's like if it's persisted and then you have actions, write file, like everything that makes sense for like write file, and you don't need like read directory or anything like that. This is about like manipulating the file system, not reading it, because you're getting it here from CodeSandbox. And then you have like type VM and then you have like start sandbox or something. Yeah, I think we have to do this, like, because we do this on CodeSandbox as well. You have to know what that ID represents. Does it represent an actual VM or does it represent something else? Now we also have a clearer separation of like this. Okay, this is interesting because this represents the levels as well. So you can do this type browser template files, done. Ephemeral, every user can manipulate, do whatever they want. Fine. And then you can say, oh, fork on change. I want to actually persist the changes the users make. So what we're going to do is we're going to fork on change, and maybe I'll use local storage for that, right? So I'm going to create a local storage entry. I'm going to give it like an identifier or whatever I use to kind of retrieve that. And then what you can do then is if you want to load that up later, yeah, whatever, sorry. So you change the URL, you get a reference to the actual thing you created. Oh, sorry. So what this does is it actually, God damn it. So what this does is actually return fork on change. Yes. So no, like that doesn't work because now if you do that, you have to mount a different Sandpack provider to open the persisted thing, to write and delete. So that's the thing I don't like about this type stuff here, because yeah, sorry. So you still need God damn it. You still need this thing. So the point is, when I do this, it means that it's generic, right? So you might load a browser thing. You might start doing that, right? So you're on a dashboard or something, and this is what you load up. And then I say, okay, so fork on change can actually still be here. So if I have that, it's actually gonna, well, fork on change. But what happens now is that this fork on change needs to return a new sandbox type. This is actually going to return. So let's change it. Or type persisted. And then the question is, so yeah, you know what? we're actually starting to get back to what we originally did, but I think it's still worth it. So, and then we have VM. Yeah, because fork on change, that's relevant for all of them. But okay, so persisted would be get sandbox. I'm not sure about like actually adding get sandbox, write file. Like you would have to add all of these. Delete file. No, but this is the thing. We can't have them here. Okay, so let's have an ID there. And then we also have type VM, which again is sandbox ID. But then it's like, we need actions to be like completely generic. We need write file, delete file, and so on. But the thing is like, if you move from, so let's say you start in browser mode and we want a seamless transition into a persisted sandbox, then these actions will make sense. These actions will make sense. But if you, but if you move from a browser sandbox to a VM, for example, then these actions doesn't make any sense. So it's almost like, these actions belongs to this thing. Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so what we could do is that like this is dynamically mounted, right? So you might, no, and the thing is like you might be on a dashboard and you're mounting this Sandpack provider and you only add this browser parcel files and that's it. And then you have fork on change. It's almost like maybe this is like more persistence. So we say fork get sandbox, write file, delete file. Oh, sorry. Let's not have fork on change there. Or you say fork on change, whatever. And the thing is that if you are on a dashboard component and you just do Sandpack provider and you just have this thing, and then you say fork on change, well, then you need persistence. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that's the thing I'm also wondering about here is that there's so, like, there are some clear paths there. The challenging thing, yeah, it's kind of either or. I feel like you either choose your use case explicitly, right? So you have like, oh no, I just want this provider. I'm just going to do ephemeral. There's no persistence or anything. So you're kind of like these levels I'm talking about. It's kind of like they're different providers. So you either do that or you say, no, I'm going to have this one provider, but then you have to define everything. Yeah, because this is interesting. So what if you just had persistence? So when you fork, it will return one of these, and it will change the sandbox mode. Yeah, but this would also have files, right? Yeah. So this would also have files. No, not that way. Yeah, internally it would have files. So if I have a dashboard, I just want ephemeral. I don't do any of this. I just say, let's remove all of these. So I just say, wait. Oh, what's that? Oh, sorry. What's this? So I'm on a dashboard. I'm creating this dashboard, and I want people to easily just play around with an example. Like I have a library, the front page. I want a sandbox. It's a browser. It uses whatever template. These are the files. Hey, test out my library, kind of thing. So this is all I do. Sandbox, browser, blah, blah, blah. But then I want to say, no, actually, I want people to be able to like sign in or whatever. And I want them to be able to not even sign in. I just want them to actually like persist things. So whenever they make a change to this thing on the dashboard, we're going to move them to a new URL. Or maybe not even a URL. We're just going to persist the thing, right? So then we would have like persistence. So we would add persistence. So when they fork, you might go to local storage or something. Yeah. So what you would do then, so let's imagine you just want to persist whatever they did on that dashboard. So if they refresh, they're going to see the same thing. So what you could do then, you could say like fork, and what it does is it just writes the files to local storage. No worries. No worries. Yeah, exactly. And then, and you shouldn't see, and the thing is like, we often talked about like seamless at CodeSandbox, which was really, really cool when we worked on the VMs. So doing like opening a browser template that you can't change, but when you actually make a change, we under the hood copy it and you feel like you're in the same experience. That's like the seamless thing for us. And that's not very hard to do. But when we move to VMs, and you can imagine you're starting to change some code that's actually running on a VM you don't have access to. But exactly when you save, under the hood, we're actually forking that VM. So you get a brand new VM under the hood, and it saves the file on that new VM instead. And then you just continue. You're in the same experience. And like being able to do that fork insanely fast is what's gonna make it feel seamless. And we actually got a really good experience. So going back to the way we handle repos, what you could do, you could always, when you wanted to start working on something new, you could actually go to your main branch, and you could start like typing. And what we did under the hood while you were typing is that we forked that VM into new VM. So at the point when you actually saved your change, you were already on this new VM, and it just saved the file. And was completely seamless that you branched out to a new VM, which was really cool. Which was technically a lot more difficult, but it's kind of a thing. But yeah, so you're on the dashboard, you fire up. So what you would do in the actual code is that you're going to look at local storage. And if I already have yeah, this is also weird. If I have a sandbox ID, but I just have something in local storage, then it's weird to put a sandbox ID here. I just want to, yeah, what would I do? Would I rather just, I just have the files. I would just shove the files in there. Yeah, like that's the thing. It's like if you want to do that that's also a thing. It's such a wide range of use cases here. So I'm probably overcomplicating it for certain use cases. But then that's also a thing. Like, do you create an API per use case? Or do you create like a generic API for any use case? Which means that the simpler use cases is going to be a bit more complex in terms of like defining the use case. So for example, here, if the use case is local storage, I would just always do this, but I would pick up the files from local storage if they exist, right? That's the only thing I would do. And then there will be like an on change. So whenever the sandbox changes, I would just do like files, and I would just write it to local storage. Done, right? Super simple. But if it's going to be part of like persistence, then suddenly I have to like think of that as a persisted sandbox kind of thing, which doesn't make any sense. So I think for use cases, it makes a lot more sense to have like a simple ephemeral provider which has no persistence. Like in the sense that you're not calling any external APIs or anything like that. There's no forking, nothing like that. But you can still do like on change if you want to do something with the changes, like writing it to local storage or whatever. But if you want real persistence, you would use a different provider. But the problem with that is if you want this experience of moving from a template but maybe that's fine. It's like, yeah. Okay, so what about this? What if there's a simple Sandpack provider, which is just, it doesn't have this. It only has, okay, so you have Sandpack provider. You still have template. It basically is what it is right now. And you have files and all of this stuff. It's just that simple Sandpack provider. Yeah, good question. So this is also like historic. So initially CodeSandbox and still does store all the browser sandboxes in a Postgres database. And that was just, yeah, it made sense at the time. It was going to be super fast and efficient, and Postgres handled that really well. Now we're reaching a limit. Like, we have to do something about persistence. We can't persist the actual code in the database anymore. And at that time, we didn't have VMs. And then you could argue, like, why not just store everything on VMs now? But we still want to have that ability for users to just use a database, or they will rely on us to do all their persistence. So that's part of the open source thing, is that the user should be able to use their own persistence. Like one guy jumped on the stream and said they're already doing this with Sandpack. They have their own database. Oh, the Git backend. Oh yeah, like that. Yeah, we're actually doing. Yeah, sorry, I'm just gonna put. So the Git backend, like, so the VMs, they use Git storage now. And then we just change the remote to GitHub if you have a GitHub repo. And that's great for like using a VM, but we wouldn't use VM strictly for persistence. Like, it would have to be to actually run code as well. Sorry if I'm misunderstanding. Because it's expensive to run a VM compared to like just storing a field in a database. Let's see. I'm gonna explore. Why not? Why aren't you pushing and pulling? I'm not sure I quite understand. Pushing and pulling rather than all this effort with literal files on disk. Mm-hmm. So why aren't you pushing on save and simply reloading the environment? Oh, so you're thinking, okay, yeah, because like we don't have, if I understand correctly, you're thinking about like us having an actual Git backend. We don't actually have a Git backend. What we're doing, it's interesting. Like we actually had a pending project once to create our own Git backend. But what we actually do on the VMs is that they're running on Git, but they have a persisted folder. It's basically pointing to a folder, the VMs. So we don't actually have like how should I put it? So the remote on a VM, like the Git remote on a VM, is pointing to a folder in the infrastructure. So there's no way for like external stuff to access that kind of silly persistence using Git. Not silly, but simple. So yeah, so we don't really have Git from the consumption point of Sandpack. But we did talk about like replacing our Postgres database with a Git backend, our own Git backend for browser sandboxes. Because then we could even use we can even use Git in the browser to handle that. And you would have like version control and everything. But that never happened because that was around the time where we were still trying to monetize sandboxes, which we failed to do. But that would do a lot of cool things. Yeah. But what if we had a Sandpack persistence provider? Because then it would make sense that you say yeah, I totally agree. Like it was the thing, we would definitely do it if we didn't pivot to VMs and trying to build this cloud development platform. We would definitely have built a Git backend for like all the browser sandboxes. Yeah, it would be so nice. Like even in like if you were playing with a prototype, you would kind of have the commit history there, and you could like jump like, and since it's like in the browser and everything, it's so insanely fast that you could just click your commit history and the preview would just update immediately, and you would actually not only see the code change, but you would see the actual code running at that moment in time. Like it would be super, super nice. But yeah, so there was this Sandpack persistence provider. So it's almost like, what if template here was not only like wasn't only like React or Parcel or whatever. You could also type in a sandbox ID, and then does this even make sense? No, I don't think I want to dive down that path. It's so annoying, like having all, like what you would think is the most difficult thing about this project is like actually actually bundling code in the browser, or running a static file server in the browser, or running code on VMs and accessing that through the browser. Like that's the easy stuff. That we're done with that. We're just trying to figure out the freaking flow and how the API should look like for handling all these different use cases. It's just like the easy way to do this, which is kind of what's been done up to this point with Sandpack, because it's grown a lot and the use cases have increased, it just makes everything optional. Like, and then it's heavy documentation on the use cases. So for this use case, you need these options. But from a consumption standpoint, everything's like optional, and you don't know how the different options ties together into the different use cases. And as an engineer, that bothers the hell out of me. Okay, so persist. Persistence. Okay, so let's just take it from scratch. So you have a Sandpack provider. You're now able to say, okay, load up this browser sandbox using this template with these files. Or you can say persisted, and this is the sandbox ID. And you can say type VM, or this is the sandbox ID. The challenge with the persisted and the VM is that they need a callback. To work. And we don't know if you're going to do this. Like, we don't know the union here. You might just write in type browser. One thing is if you literally wrote type persisted, like that's the option you would pass here, then we could create typing that ensure that, oh, you actually have a type persisted. That means we need a get sandbox property as well to be able to go and grab that thing. Or you would actually write in type VM with a sandbox ID. Oh, we need start sandbox then. And maybe that is the case. Like if you do like CodeSandbox, you would have different URLs. You would have different Sandpack providers mounted in different components. And we would actually infer this correctly. And then the final question is, okay, that's fine. That would work. You would get proper typing. If you had persisted, you would also have to provide like write file, read file, blah, 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 blah. And if you were to move from persisted to a VM, for example, then it doesn't have to be seamless. Like on CodeSandbox, you can do that. You can move from a browser sandbox to a VM, but that's not a seamless experience. That's fine. So, what was I gonna say? Yeah, so then the case is like, so imagine you have a URL of like playground. So it starts with playground, and then you have playground sandboxes. Yeah, or you, yeah, I don't know. This bothers me. Playground. And then you have VMs, and that would have like a different ID. It would be so much nicer to, I can't, it would be so much, like we can do this. So you have playground, and then you just have an ID. Like, I don't think it should matter if it's a VM or if it's just a normally persisted sandbox. The experience is exactly the same. So we shouldn't leak, again, we shouldn't leak into URLs or even the API here that there's this specific VM sandbox. I just don't like it. So it's not, what did we call it? Browser or remote or whatever. Import. That's also a thing we could do. We could do sandbox. Oh, this is interesting. So, you know what we could also do? We, instead of type browser, like you can, so a sandbox can be a string, which is the ID of a sandbox. Oh, this is interesting. What about this? So a sandbox can be, okay, I have some ID here. So I'm going to load up that. And if you have that, then we need to have these actions that we talked about. That's gonna, so if type of sandbox is a string, you need actions because it means you have a reference to a sandbox. So you need get sandbox, blah, 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 blah. But if you say, no, I'm just going to do a static sandbox here. So I'm just going to give you some files. This is the template. This is the active file, whatever. Then you don't need actions. That's a very simplified thing that really explains. Like that's the minimal, most precise way, I think, to just say, no, I want to define a sandbox that's going to run here. Or I'm going to use a reference. That makes a lot of sense. And then we could do, if you give it, as I said, a string reference, we're going to require you to create actions so that we can grab that sandbox. The question now is just, we don't know if it's a VM or a browser sandbox. So we don't know if you need to have write file, delete file, and stuff like that. Yeah, good luck, Mark. Thanks so much for all the input and there's a shit ton of there's 5 years of context here. So I really appreciate you diving into it and asking me questions and everything, because it really getting stuck on these things. It's kind of like having a spatula. You're kind of janking me out of my trail of thought, which is really great, because I need all the help I can to get unstuck on this. So thanks a bunch. Let's see. Okay, so let's just run with this. So we have this thing, and there's a couple of things we want to deal with. So now we just say, now we cover 2 use cases. The 2 use cases are, no, I just want to do an ephemeral thing. There's no persistence, nothing. That's when you pass an object to the sandbox. But if you pass a string, we know that it's going to be a sandbox you're going to fetch. So you need these actions. And we're going to assume that it's a browser sandbox. So we're also going to do write file and delete file. Now, we don't know, it could be a VM, which means that we don't actually care about these. Oh, you know what we could do? We could also do... Yeah, because this is the thing. Like, we don't... Yeah, I just think it's confusing. That you have a write file. Like, again, if we use the REST endpoint, if we use REST, but then we can't have things like the terminal. That requires WebSocket. And it's faster. Like you're actually running a session here. So we kind of do want to use that WebSocket thing. Yeah, I don't... This is the most tricky thing. This is definitely the most tricky thing to explain through the Surface API. That this reference might be a VM that doesn't require write file, delete file, blah, 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 blah. Or it might be a persisted sandbox that does require write file, delete file, blah, 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 blah. But okay, what if get sandbox would rather be a function like this? Because that's the same, right? Between both of them. And then we say optionally you can do fork on change. That's also the same on both of them, on a VM and a persisted sandbox. Now the challenge is the other ones, like write file, delete file. Okay. But that's just one thing. So I'm stuck on that one. But then it's the other thing where, okay, no, I'm actually going to do the object version here, right? And then I'm going to say fork on change. And then I want to stay with this thing. So now I'm not prompt to add like get sandbox. That's fine. But I would still need these actions. So, but that's weird. Like fork on change is the thing that requires you to put the actions there. But if fork on change goes to a VM, you don't need those actions. I'm getting hungry. I feel so frustrated that I have to spend so much time on this. Or like, no, I don't mean that. I feel frustrated because I'm using so much time on this. But we have to figure this out. We have to keep that super accessible API, but we still need to introduce configuration for all these use cases in a way that makes sense. It's almost like you would like configure what you want to be able to do here. It's like capabilities kind of thing. So you kind of say, I don't know, but that's weird. Like persistence, VMs. It's kind of weird, but if you did that, we could also infer that and give you the correct options you needed to do. But that's like, you're just doing that to like get the correct typing, which is weird, which is super weird. But yeah, again, maybe this is just, maybe this should just be optional. Read file. Maybe this should just be optional. Well, we don't do read file, do we? It's delete file. Well, you know what we could also do? We, instead of having that, we could do like on change. We could keep on change. And then we would give you the type of change. Because then it would make more sense to, oh, this is interesting. So what if we just did on change? And then you have an event, and that event tells you the type of change, kind of like a watcher, like a file system watcher, right? So you have the event, and then you would have like, yeah, but there are different events for the different environments. I guess. No, sorry. So you would have Sandbox here. And the Sandbox would have like, you still have like static Sandbox, bundler Sandbox, or VM Sandbox. Where static and, yeah, this makes sense. So you still have those, because we already have those types. So you have an event on the file system, and you can access the Sandbox. So then you can say if Sandbox type equals bundler or static, or not equal to VM, or sorry, Sandbox environment, not equal to VM. You kind of want to go persist event dot code, whatever. Depends on the event. So you'd rather have this like general sense of changes, and that this works much better with like local storage as well. And then I think fork on change still makes sense. Get Sandbox would only be there if you have a string. Then it would require get Sandbox. So fork on change basically means you treat it as a template. And this is what you're going to do whenever a change happens. And this is going to return the actual Sandbox thing, the same thing as get Sandbox needs to return. Okay. We're getting to something here. So the only thing is making this blocking. So we could do return, like fetch, write file kind of thing. So we could return on change and make it blocking, but it's weird. On change represents an event listener, and they aren't blocking. But at the same time, it's kind of nice to be able to do that. So fork on change is blocking. Yeah. And then on change. Yeah, it's important because it might fail writing and stuff. So we need to know what happens there. I'm going to ask ChatGPT. What do you think about making an event handler blocking? Allowing it to return a promise. Is that weird or okay? It's not inherently weird. Straightforward async. If your handler needs to do IO right, returning a promise means you don't have to fire and forget. You can await the result before moving on. Are appropriate. If the event especially itself awaits your handler, any rejection bubbles up. Yeah. Yeah. Framework expectations. Yeah, well, that's fine. But we want it to be blocking. Like we control the UI, so that's... Okay, but we can do... Okay. Yeah, but I don't want to have on before persist. Yeah, perfectly fine. Okay, we're gonna do that. So what's nice about this is that we're still very close to the existing API surface, and this simplifies a ton. So we're gonna have, okay, so if you have a string, you have to put in get sandbox. You can optionally put fork on change. So fork on change will be in the scenario where the user doesn't have read access, but you want them to like be able to just start manipulating and then move on to their own version of it. So I think that makes sense, and it should be blocking. And then onChange has the actual file system event, and it gives you the sandbox, which is like static sandbox, bundler sandbox, or VM sandbox. And then it can return a promise, which will act as a blocking thing, which is going to show a loading indication or an error in Sandpack. Or if you just do like local storage stuff here, you don't have to return it, right? Because it's synchronous. Okay, we're going to do this. You know what? Maybe we could even like sandbox is a function. Oh, I like this. And then you just do fetch whatever. I like that. And then that simplifies even more. So I like this. Either you have like this is literally what it means. Either you have a static sandbox, so you pass in an object, and we could even have the simplified templates here, like parcel, right? So that would still be the same. But if you pass a function, it means you're dynamically creating the sandbox, right? This is perfect. And then you can optionally set fork on change. And then you have on change to actually handle changes to the sandbox. You could argue that on change could also include like is first change or something. And then you would choose to fork here. But then that doesn't make sense because it needs to actually return the new sandbox, right? For reference. The thing that we are missing here though is the ID. So if I do fork on change, what do we call this stuff? I forgot all the typing now. So we have, okay, so we're not gonna have, yeah, so we have bundler sandbox, and then a session, but we'll need the ID of the sandbox. Well, we're not gonna have these two anymore, or persisted and ephemeral. Environment static. So this makes a lot of sense to me. I'm gonna call these entry, by the way. We're not gonna have this thing. We're not gonna have this thing. What do we call ephemeral sandbox or persisted sandbox? Let's just remove that for now. And this one. And then we're gonna say yeah, static sandbox or bundler sandbox or string. No actions. We're only gonna have on change. Oh, let's see. What did we talk about? Yeah, the sandbox ID. So the point is that these can actually have a sandbox ID. So what would that mean? That will mean that when you get this sandbox, yeah, so what's kind of annoying here is that fork on change is going to guarantee that you have a sandbox ID here in practice. Or if you do this, you're guaranteed to have a sandbox ID. But there's also a version of onChange that doesn't have a sandbox ID. So if you were to do like static and do this, there is no sandbox ID. But if you did this, it's guaranteed to have a sandbox ID. Or if you did this, it's guaranteed to have a sandbox ID. Um, no, but I think we just have to make it optional. So if sandbox environment is not equal to VM and like sandbox.id, then you would like the sandboxes /id write file kind of thing. Yeah, and you know what we could do is, yeah, this is interesting. We don't have to trigger on change for a VM. So we could say that on change only triggers for static and bundler sandboxes. Or we could also do on yeah, there's something about you could do on change. No, but that doesn't make sense. So that you get information about the sandbox makes sense to me. But when it's a VM, you don't actually have files there. It's kind of weird that you kind of have to write this every time. Like you always have to do like if sandbox environment equals VM or no sandbox ID, return, right? It's weird. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm gonna get some food and think about this part, but we're getting close. We're getting very close. It's almost like yeah, no, we kind of have to check that. Like if you want to use on change to do persistence. Yeah. It's a bit low level, but we could argue that you actually don't get VM here at all, because it doesn't make any sense to listen to VM changes. Maybe you want it for other things. No, but I think this actually makes sense. So I'm gonna eat some food. I'm gonna test Oblivion. Okay, cool. I just got feedback that using REST was a good idea. So I think we're actually gonna... That's also the cool thing, is that we can choose... Can we choose that now? Oh, this is interesting. Like, how would we... Oh, now that becomes a problem using REST, because we have to know when we pass that ID to our endpoint for writing, we have to know if it's for actual VM or is for the browser. Damn it, I just created another problem for myself. Because okay, so what if you wanted to use the REST API? So you would just return you wouldn't return a session ID. You would rather return... What would you return? Well, you would still return that it's a VM. I wonder what... but we have this session. So the question is, does the VM return an actual session? So if it returns a session... what I'm wondering is if we should rather just on fork on change here. No, I guess we need to make the session optional. So no, wait, yeah, no, it's a different environment. It's a different environment. Because now the file system, like, it's not an actual VM environment. Yeah, it needs to be a different environment, because now we have to actually like read the directory. And everything. How would we do that? Oh, why did I do this to myself? How would we do that? Because now if we have a session, we just use that sandbox session to read files and everything. But now we have to... Oh, yeah, but we still have... Okay. No, sorry. So we can still do that, but yeah, sorry. So the way we would handle that is you have environment options. So by default, we would use WebSocket, for example. But now for the VM environment, you could say WebSocket false. And then it's gonna rather use the REST. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. So you would do an environment option where you would turn off like using WebSocket. And then what would happen is that it would start calling onChange instead. Or it will still call onChange, sorry. It will always call onChange. But what about read file and read directory and stuff? How'd that work? Because it's not in memory anymore. It would actually have to call the API to do that. No, I think, yeah, but the thing is you can actually call it from the browser. That's the thing. It doesn't need to be called from the server. But then we choose how to do that. Then we're going to use fetch to do it, but maybe that's fine. Okay, but we're not going to worry about that for now. But I think maybe it will be an option of the VM environment to use REST or WebSocket, like protocol REST. But then you can't use shells and stuff. Maybe that was just a bad idea. Like the best experience is like these are sessions, and the best experience you get with a session is using WebSocket. So I'm gonna just take that one back. Okay, great. Great. I think we're set. So I'm gonna eat some food. I'm gonna do a brief session with a colleague, and then I'm gonna jump back into this because I'm really pumped to get this actually running. And then we're gonna make write file and all these actions actually trigger onChange, and it's also gonna trigger like in the different environments. And then we're gonna make that writing of file work for the VM, and it's gonna work for the persisted sandbox as well. Okay, I'm pumped. Great stuff. Bye for now. See you soon.